The end of man, a resurrection telos to redeem our anthropology. We're in the throes of a particularly misanthropic moment. Suddenly, it's cool to hate mankind. There's nothing new under the sun, and other civilizations, teetering on the precipice of collapse, have all had their unique misanthropy. Gnostic dualism, destruction of the nuclear family, rejection of the goodness and complementarity of male and female, and more. But consider just a few symptoms of our own. Since the Genesis 3 curse promised an eventual offspring of the woman who would crush the serpent's head, the devil has hated babies. After Donald Trump won the presidency, many young women on social media proclaimed their new allegiance to the 4B movement, a feminist movement originating in South Korea, which itself boasts the lowest birth rate in all Asia. The 4Bs are 4 no's. I won't try to pronounce them in Korean, but they are no marriage, no childbirth, no dating, no sex. Instead of smashing the patriarchy, the movement just refuses to participate in any relationships with men that might make them husbands or fathers, and advocates for the self-autonomy of women. 5 years before that, there was the birth strike movement, women pledging not to have any more children until climate change was reversed. Their website still boasts, "Are you terrified about the future that lies ahead for contemporary and future youth? Do you want to maximize your positive impact on the climate change crisis? Are you tired of leaders ignoring the needs of humanity and perpetuating a constant state of consumption and destruction?" And then get this, I kid you not. You can protect children while fighting climate change and systematic corruption by refusing to procreate. That is, by not having children whom you might need to protect. Before that, there was the voluntary human extinction movement, which promises phasing out the human species by voluntarily ceasing to breed will allow Earth's biosphere to return to good health. Crowded conditions and resource shortages will improve as we become less dense. The very primitive HTML of their website indicates that they've only seemed to have made some humans extinct, the web developers, perhaps. But if you're being honest, with all that extra disposable income you'll have from not having children, you'll take more vacations, buy more useless stuff, dine out more, all of which will significantly increase your carbon footprint. Or maybe you're persuaded by the philosophy of David Benatar, a so-called anti-natalist. In his 2006 book, Better Not to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, Benatar argues, while good people go to great lengths to spare their children from suffering, few of them seem to notice that the one and only guaranteed way to prevent all the suffering of their children is not to bring those children into existence in the first place. Despite 91% of Americans describing themselves as very happy, or at worst, rather happy, Benatar has a long list of woes. He says, "We're almost always hungry or thirsty. When we're not, we must go to the bathroom. We often experience thermal discomfort. We are too hot or too cold, or are too tired and unable to nap. We suffer from itches, allergies, and colds, menstrual pains, and hot flashes. Life is a procession of frustrations and irritations, waiting in traffic, standing in line, filling out forms. Forced to work, we often find our jobs exhausting. Even those who enjoy their work may have professional aspirations that remain unfulfilled. Many lonely people remain single, while those who marry fight and divorce. People want to be, look, and feel younger, and yet they age relentlessly. They have high hopes for their children, and those are often thwarted when, for example, the children prove to be a disappointment in some way or other. When those close to us suffer, we suffer at the sight of it. When they die, we are bereft." Against your arguments, Benatar would counter, for an existing person, the presence of bad things is bad, and the presence of good things is good. But compare that with a scenario in which that person never existed. Then the absence of the bad would be good, but the absence of the good wouldn't be bad, because there'd be nobody to be deprived of those good things. Perhaps the only thing better not to have been is Benatar's book. Persuaded? Maybe you're not, but many Americans are. In 2020, the U.S. fertility rate dropped to an astonishingly low 1.64 births per woman, far below the replacement rate of 2.1 and plummeting toward the rate below which no country has ever survived. 1.3 is lower than any society has ever recovered from. In 2020, the global birth rate declined by 1.12%. In 2021, it declined by 1.13, and in 2022, it declined by 1.15. Currently, Canada is at 1.4 children per woman. Germany, Austria, Russia, Italy, and Spain are well below the survivability rate, which includes the massive influx of Muslim immigrants to those countries. Back in 2008, Mark Steyn wrote, "When it comes to forecasting the future, the birth rate is the nearest thing to hard numbers. If only 1 million babies are born in 2006, it's hard to have 2 million adults enter the workforce in 2026, or 2033, or 2037, or whenever they get around to finishing their anger management and queer studies degrees." And the hard data on babies around the Western world is that they're running out a lot faster than the oil is. Replacement fertility rate, that is, the number you need for a merely stable population, not getting any bigger nor getting any smaller, is 2.1 babies per woman. Some countries are well above that. The global fertility leader, Somalia, is at 6.91, Niger 6.83, Afghanistan 6.78, Yemen 6.75. Notice what those nations have in common, and those statistics are almost 2 decades old. Quomodo hoc venimus, how did we get here? Charles Taylor and the Rise of the Robots. Charles Taylor's A Secular Age is a monumental undertaking, an attempt to answer the question of Western civilization's diminishing belief and the rise of secularism. Grappling with Taylor in order to establish an anthropology is essential, as so many modern anthropological treatments begin with Taylor. He notes the enormous change that prompts his inquiry. There's been a titanic change in our Western civilization. We've changed not just from a condition where most people lived naively in a construal, which Taylor says was part Christian, part related to spirits of pagan origin, as a simple reality, to one in which now no one is capable of this, but all see it, their option as one among many. But we've also changed from a condition in which belief was the default option, not just for the sake of the naive, but also for those who knew, considered, talked about atheism, to a condition in which, for more and more people, unbelieving construals seem at first blush to be the only plausible ones. In 1500, for instance, belief in God was so much a part of the fabric of people's everyday lives, there's no option for what we know today as atheism. Unbelief in the 1500s did not mean rejecting God in favor of a more secular humanistic worldview, what Taylor calls the buffered self. It simply meant giving oneself over to forces other than God, leaving the faith and thus God, but not abandoning the belief that God exists. 3 features of Western society in the 1500s and earlier made unbelief nearly impossible: a cosmology that saw the natural world proof of divine purpose and action, belief that the structures of society were divinely established and preserved, and understanding the world as enchanted, filled with spirits, demons, and moral forces. Gradually, as these 3 pillars of the worldview that necessitates belief in God crumble, so does the belief they support. Taylor credits reform movements within the church with a gradual shift away from Orthodox Christianity's embrace of the incarnation to what he calls excarnation, rejection of the body in favor of faith existing in the mind, pursuit of morality apart from redemption. Taylor says, as we move from the Cambridge Platonists through Tillotson and Locke and the 18th century, apologetics, and indeed much preaching, is less and less concerned with sin as a condition we need to be rescued from through some transformation of our being, and more with sin as wrong behavior, which can be persuaded, trained, or disciplined to turn our backs on. Religion is narrowed, Taylor says, to moralism. God as creator replaced Jesus as savior, as providential deism slowly replaced Orthodox Christianity as the default Western creed. God has designed us to flourish when the thinking of theistic humanism, we owe him the achievement of our own good. The move from deism to exclusive humanism has created what Taylor calls a nova effect, an explosion of options the individual has for believing or not believing. The buffered self is no longer open, vulnerable to a world of spirits and forces which cross the boundary of the mind. The fears, anxieties, even terrors that belong to the porous self are behind it. This sense of self-possession, of a secure inner mental realm, is all the stronger if, in addition to disenchanting the world, we've also taken the anthropomorphic turn and no longer even draw on the power of God. In this supernova, the self has transcended the world. Finally, Taylor describes a change in eras. From the end of the Age of Mobilization, the 1800s through 1960, to the emergence of what he calls the Age of Authenticity. No longer are people bullied by the modern moral order into participating in some particular group as an expression of their individual beliefs. Now each person has his own way of realizing the fullness of his humanity. This quest for fullness has guided Taylor's trajectory. Today, the three features that 500 years ago made belief in God necessary have altogether been replaced by exclusive humanism. The world is now disenchanted. Societal structures exist apart from the imprimatur and preservation of any deity, and scientific understanding of the world has relieved man of finding God in the natural world. So today, unbelief is the default position for people living in a secularized society. Contemporary to that last shift that Taylor observes has been a relatively rapid societal economic evolution as well. Consider the effects of the Industrial Revolution on each of our understandings of what is a human being. Prior to the rise of the factory, each home was its own economy. In Greek, the word oikonomia is household, but it transliterates into English as economy. The Small Catechism assumes the head of the family is teaching the laborers in his household as well. But the rise of the factory broke down the household economies. Where the family cooperage was once the place where Mr. and Mrs. Cooper not only raised their children, but it was the place their neighbors came when they were in need of a new barrel. The household provided complementary work for Mr. and Mrs. Cooper, for parents and the Cooper children to labor toward a common goal by doing different tasks. Mr. Cooper was the specialist, needing to know what species of wood will yield the best staves, how to keep his tools sharp, and what angles to cut to make leak-proof seams between staves. He needed rudimentary knowledge of tensile strength and the properties of steel, which he learned from Mr. Smith, perhaps over a pint of ale made by Mr. Brewer, drawn from a barrel made by a previous generation of Coopers, and how to rivet his hoop and hammer it down evenly onto the staves. He needed to know joinery techniques and how to cut a nice circle to make the top and the bottom of the barrel. He needed to know every aspect of the barrel-making craft, not to mention how to repair damaged barrels brought into Mrs. Cooper, who was managing the interaction with barrel buyers. His children slowly learned his trade while fetching tools and tidying up around the workshop, until the factory reduced Mr. Cooper to a cog in the barrel-making assembly line. No longer was his vast knowledge of all things barrel valuable to the industry. It actually made him a liability to the factory, as he was prone to wander off his post of setting rivets in the hoop to inspect the angles of the staves or the quality of the raw wood. His contribution to the household was reduced to a slip of paper that told him how much he was providing for his family, most of which went to the landlord at their new apartment in the city, as families move from their rural and agrarian homesteads to the urban factory oases. Then it was to this dehumanized factory that Mrs. Cooper and her second-wave feminist sisters fought for the right to go, arguing that she had to leave the mundane tasks of child-rearing and homemaking in order to do something more worthwhile with her life, and likewise determine her worth to her husband and children by the size of the number on the pay stub that she brought home. So while Mr. Cooper hammered away to set 200 rivets a day and tried to forget what he knew about side axes and draw knives, Mrs. Cooper carried armloads of staves to the assembly line while trying to avoid the leering gaze of the foreman and keep her mind from wondering how her children were faring at the daycare. The machine age quickly gave way to the computer age, and, if the Coopers are lucky, eventually to the robot age. Perhaps automation will free them from their bondage to the assembly line so they can retire early, return to their empty apartment, and sell trinkets on Etsy made from the staves of old whiskey barrels. Neil Postman, a student of Marshall McLuhan who coined the famous phrase, "the medium is the message," describes the shift from a tool-using culture to what he calls a technopoly. The difference is that to use tools and not to be controlled by tools, not to be controlled by the technology itself, requires moral resources to constrain and direct the use of those tools. But now, in technopoly, the tool is the master. It uses you and it steamrolls previous moral constraints. To wit, every one of you probably has a smartphone. But no one seems capable anymore of asking the question of whether that's good or bad to give children a screen to stare at for hours a day. Jonathan Haidt, author of The Anxious Generation, says, "We're performing the largest uncontrolled experiment humanity has ever performed on its own children." Writing at Haidt's blog, AfterBabel.com, Nicholas Smith, professor of ethics and social philosophy at Fordham University, where Postman was a student of McLuhan in the 1960s, says, "For the past few years, I've been teaching a class called Ethics and the Internet. On day one, I always put the question to the class: if you could erase the smartphone and social media from ever having existed, which is to say, not just would you give up your smartphone and your access to social media, but just remove it, delete it altogether from human history, would you do it?" Over the past 3 years, 81% of them have said yes. These students are, of course, not representatives of the general student population, but even if the real number were something like 50%, something funny is going on. So he asks them, can you think of a new technology at any point in history where half of its primary users quickly wish it had never been invented? By contrast, he says, consider the humble washing machine. It's hard to overstate the extent to which the primary users of this tech enthusiastically embraced it, despite a few early safety issues. You can be fairly sure that 10 years after it spread to most homes, it was not the case that 50% of the users of the washing machine would have wished it had never been invented. Now, we're in the deluge of rapidly evolving generative artificial intelligence, and who can speculate, though many will try, where this ends? If the AI doomsayers are right, human extinction might not need to be voluntary, nor will it be too far in the future. But then, the massive amounts of energy required to run the servers so high school kids can pull a fast one on their teachers seem likely to mean the robots will leave just as big, if not a bigger, carbon footprint as the humans. But fear not, the robots won't completely replace mankind. At least that's what AI tells me for now. But if they take all of our jobs, we'll be left with a lot of time to contemplate what really is the point of being a human being. Toward a better anthropology. The general Protestant anthropology is usually some variation of the first question and answer in the shorter Westminster Catechism of the Reformed Church, which asks, what is the chief end of man? Anyone know the answer? To glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. This is deficient. In Genesis 2, in the middle of the sixth day of creation, having made Adam in his own image, but before making woman from man's side, having called each of the previous 5 days of creation good, when you overlay Genesis 1 and 2, in Genesis 2:18, something is conspicuously not good. But the Creator's own assessment, it is not good for the man to be alone, If the Calvinists were right that the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him, what would have been the point of this observation? Adam has God. And in such a sinless state, he could do exactly what the Westminster Shorter Catechism says is his chief end. But God says this is not good. It's difficult to derive a genuinely Lutheran anthropology because so much of what we say about human nature in the Confessions is said in the negative. Original sin has corrupted man's nature, and yet human nature remains God's good creation, the Formula of Concord, Epitome 1. Fallen man's will is bound only to sin and has no powers to work any part of his regeneration, Epitome 2. The union between Christ's divine and human natures is such that he has a perfect, full human nature, uncorrupted by original sin, Epitome 7. But behind the negative is also a positive assumption about what is a human being. Melanchthon, for instance, as long as our opponents will agree that the sin of our first parents has so completely rendered all of us children of Adam and Eve guilty from conception, he will allow the Imago Dei to include more than just perfect faith. In the Apology, Article 2, he says, therefore, original righteousness includes not only physical health in all ways, as they contend, but also these gifts, a sure and certain knowledge of God, fear of God, confidence in God, and the desire and ability to give God these things. Noteworthy is the singular statement, as far as I can tell, in the Confessions of the telos, the goal, the end of man. In Augsburg 23, God created man for procreation. No reference to this passage from the Confessions in any of the antinatalist literature. Within the negative, Chemnitz bids us ground our anthropology in all other dimensions of Christian doctrine, saying in Epitome 1, for this doctrine, that no distinction is to be made between our corrupt human nature and original sin, conflicts with the chief articles of our Christian faith about creation, redemption, sanctification, and the resurrection of our body. Creation, redemption, and sanctification, and the resurrection of the body, or roughly, the first Adam and the second Adam, original man and man restored. In the garden is a proper picture of anthropology, and in the resurrection is the fulfillment of the Creator's intention for man. For us, then, anthropology is a kind of narrative that connects the first man to the resurrection by means of the incarnation of the second person of the triune God. And it imbues man's daily existence with a new kind of telos, an end where the resurrection grants a new kind of purpose to his daily existence. In creation, God makes mankind in his image and likeness. Man is thus distinct from all other creatures in bearing the image of God. The change in language in Genesis 1:26 is noteworthy. The introduction of a first-person plural pronoun, which has not existed in the text before, let us, and the introduction of a new verb, make. While the original righteousness of man is lost in the fall, it will be restored to man in the one from whom creation has been the full image and likeness of God, as St. Paul describes him to the Corinthians, describes Christ. He is the image of the Colossians. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Colossians 1:15-17. Johann Gerhard, in his Theological Commonplaces, describes the image of God like this. You see, the image of God consists primarily and principally of the conformity of the rational soul and all its powers with God and with the law of God, and of prescribed righteousness, holiness, and truth. Consequently, the light of wisdom and understanding shone in the mind. A consistent desire for good was in the will. Delight and approval was in the heart, and complete submission, free of any resistance, was in all other powers. tranquility of conscience, secure peace of mind, freedom from all pain and rebellion, eternal safety and wholeness of all faculties were conjoined with this perfection of the soul. The first words of God to mankind are, of course, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion. This mandate confesses the original purpose of mankind. Procreation is obviously intended, but also the filling and the causing to flourishing of the rest of creation as well, and have dominion. Luther speculates on what the fuller image of God might have been. Wherefore that image of God created in Adam was a workmanship, the most beautiful, the most excellent, and the most noble, while as yet no leprosy of sin adhered either to his reason or to his will. Then all his senses, both internal and external, were the most perfect and pure. His intellect was most clear, his memory most complete, and his will the most sincere, accompanied with the most charming security, without any fear of death and without any care or anxiety whatever. To these internal perfections of Adam was added a power of body and of all his limbs, so beautiful and so excellent that he surpassed all other animate creatures. For I fully believe that before his sin, the eyes of Adam were so clear and their sight so acute that his powers of vision exceeded those of the lynx. Adam, I believe, being stronger than they, handled the lions and the bears whose strength is so great as we handle the young of any animal. I believe also that to Adam the sweetness and the virtue of the fruits which he ate were far beyond our enjoyment of them now. Though the righteousness and the faith of the image of God is completely lost in the fall, as the confessions affirm, something remains. Enough, at least, for God to prohibit the shedding of man's blood even after the flood, because man was originally made in the image of God. The original image of God grants not only uniqueness to man among all other creatures, but also dignity and purpose. Image is connected to telos, and man's purpose is to have dominion. He is God to the rest of creation, for the flourishing and the care of the rest of creation. In Genesis 2, God plants his Adam in the garden to work it and keep it. Work, essential to our anthropology, then, pre-exists the fall, is good even before it's difficult. Work remains intrinsic to man's purpose, even after Genesis 3, though he must now sweat as he pulls the weeds. Moreover, the law exists before the fall, as God places a limit on man's existence in the garden. Eat from all the trees except the one. This limit is, on the one hand, external, like Chesterton's illustration of the fence, children playing on a cliff's edge, safeguarded from danger by a secure fence. As long as the fence exists, the children can't see the danger that exists just on the other side. They play freely without fear. Were you to remove the fence, though, you would then find the children huddled together in fear in the middle of the play yard. Boundaries, limits, are not only good, they are also helpful and intended to lead to human flourishing, and thus are intrinsic to what it means to be a human being, a creature. After the fall, man's limits, dictated in the fuller revelation of God's law, keep his self-destructive hubris in check. Before the fall, limits define man as a creature. They were intended to place him in relationship with his Creator. He's commanded to eat from one tree, but not another. One limit requires him to eat in order to live. The other forbids him to eat lest he die. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer observed, these limits are not something merely external to man that he needs to observe. They are also internal at his very core. Bonhoeffer distinguishes between the kinds of limits that keep man in his proper place, limits external to him, like a fence, and limits that define who man is, limits at the center of his being. Man's limit is in the middle of his existence, not on the edge. Eat from the tree of life is a command to the man to be dependent upon his Creator. The limit we look for on the edge is the limit of his condition, of his technology, of his possibilities. The limit in the middle is the limit of his reality, of his true existence. In the knowledge of this limit, in the middle of man's existence, man's being from every possible standpoint is limited. But instead of restraining him, this limit calls man to live a life of faith with a posture of receptivity towards his Creator. The limit that man is creature and not the Creator, then, is a kind of grace. In addition to the limit that marks man as a creature, when God creates from Adam another human being for him to love and toward whose good he can order his life and serve it, he sets up another limit intrinsic to Adam's being. He is not Eve. She is from him, but she is not he. He needs her and she him. This limit, like the prohibition not to eat from the tree in the middle of the garden, frees Adam to live as he was created to be. Mankind is complementary, and in their complementarity, the man and the woman are free to be, respectively, man and woman. Not everything he can do, she can do, nor everything she can do, can he do. And this is, to borrow a phrase, very good. The fall seeks to transgress limits, both the external boundaries and also the internal dependence. In rejecting their limits, Adam and Eve become their own gods, their own arbiters of right and wrong. Immediately after their rebellion, they lose not only their creaturely identity, they also lose their vocations toward one another. Their gaze turns inward, as for the first time they notice their own nakedness, and in the midst of this new self-awareness, they experience the navel-gazing emotion of shame. Bonhoeffer writes, "In the first place, the middle has been entered. The limit has now been transgressed. Now man stands in the middle. Now he is without limit. That he stands in the middle means that now he lives out of his own resources and no longer from the middle. That he is without a limit means that he is alone. To be in the middle and to be alone means to be like God. Man is sicut Deus. Now he lives out of himself. Now he creates his own life. Now he is his own creator. Together with the limit, Adam has lost his creatureliness. Limitless Adam can no longer be addressed in his creatureliness. To be human, then, is also to be limited. We could and should, if time permitted, say more. More is given to the first man and more is lost in the fall. But all that has been given and lost is restored in the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection of the new Adam. And in the in-between, sin is just not living your best life. Sin is rather subhuman. Sinners are less than very good. Death is unnatural. Good work now is fraught with complications. A proper theological anthropology is thus rooted in justification and fixated on full restoration in the resurrection. A sinner made saint is made human again, now and not yet. Your future is more human than your yesterday, because a sinless Christ is more human than the sinners he redeems, but not whom he resurrects. So let's get really practical. The resurrection imbues your today with new meaning, new purpose, a renewed goal, a telos. The future is human. To interpret his own perplexing parable of the dishonest manager, Jesus says, "Make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings." Luke 16:9. He bids you ask, what survives the resurrection? People. This, then, shapes your daily ethics. Friends to receive you into your eternal dwellings. Let the voluntary human extinction doomsayers contracept themselves out of existence. If you have hope for the resurrection of all the dead, then you will invest your unrighteous wealth in people who will rise on the last day. Build a home to shelter human beings. Keep your hand to the plow of tasks that feel the most mundane and maybe the most tedious for the least grateful people, little kids. Do laundry and make meals for bodies that will rise on that day. Wipe noses and butts destined to rise from the grave. Be always open to the Lord's gift of a new person, an eternal friend when he opens the womb. Raise a family, defend a church, do good, enduring work that in the resurrection will be praiseworthy. Alone remains not good. Hell is the loneliest place in the cosmos. The rich man doesn't even have a companion to soothe his tongue with a drop of water. Proper biblical anthropology must be communal in two directions, not just toward God, but also toward man. The chief end of God is communion with God, with mankind, and with the rest of creation. Thank you.
Excellent presentation. Thank you. The effects you talked about in terms of losing the economy and going off in the factory work and so forth, and the importance of living in community, especially as you had there at the end. One of the other things that I think probably has affected this is kind of the focus on only the nuclear family, if you will, and the disconnectedness that we have by moving away from the family farms and not having the collective memory and things of that nature. Can you talk about, do you have thoughts on like the spiritual impact of that, or, and
well,
to the community?
Not good for man to be alone. God's solution is not just to give him a bride, but from that bride then to give him children, to give him a tribe, and from his children to give him grandchildren, and from his grandchildren to give him a congregation and a neighborhood and a community and a state, right? I mean, all that is the intent of how God solves the problem he created, that man is alone. A declaration not unlike his question to Adam after the fall, "Where are you?" He, of course, knows. He creates this not good predicament so that you might know, right? So that 2:18 can be recorded for you, that it's not good for man to be alone. But yeah, so all the other dimensions, all the other communities God creates out of that union between Adam and his bride help solve that aloneness. And what we lose in this move from the rural agrarian home economy kind of setting for man into the more urbanized factory is that everyone is reduced to an individual again. Everyone is alone, right? So we don't completely break up the nuclear family at the beginning, but we surely take him away from the family farm, away from grandma and grandpa, and we put him, in little individual pods within a great big apartment building, where even though he's closer to people, he's still even more alone than his proximity to others would indicate. Um, and right, I mean, even we could say more about what does Christianity become in the factory, the industrial revolution mentality, right? You just become a cog in the machine of the church. It's just about you and God, not about this horizontal community of you and all the other confessors of Christ. So yeah, community is more than just the man and the woman, though that's sort of the heart of how God fixes their problem. But then he expands it like ripples in a pond, spreading out beyond it. He fixes their aloneness with all the other facets of communal life as well.
Thank you, Reverend Hemmer.
Yeah, thank you.